In 364 CE, a council removed the Book of Enoch from Scripture. One passage inside it was cut even harder than the rest, a section describing Mars not as rock and rust, but as something bleeding. That alone would be forgettable. What isn't forgettable is the sentence directly after it, the one most translations quietly drop, the one that stops describing Mars and starts describing us. 2 manuscripts preserve it. Neither scholar who studied both has published what it says in full. Tonight, we read the part they left out. The passage we're following tonight survives in 2 places that were never supposed to agree with each other. The first is a Ge'ez manuscript, held in a restricted collection outside Gondar, catalogued only as the Second Judgment Cycle, a section scholars generally treat as a minor appendix to the main Enoch text. The second is a Coptic fragment recovered from a monastic library in Upper Egypt in the 1950s, cross-referenced by catalogers as Fragment C14, though it has never been formally published in full. Elena Marchetti, a manuscript historian who spent 3 years working directly with the Gondar collection under a limited research visa, referenced the Second Judgment Cycle in a 2016 conference abstract, describing its language as unusually direct for a text of its period. She has not published on it since. Her subsequent papers move in other directions entirely, and when asked about the passage in a 2021 interview, she described her focus as having shifted. Thomas Aldwych, whose 2009 critical edition of the Ethiopian Enoch corpus remains one of the few English-language references scholars still cite for this section, includes a translation of the passage's opening lines. His edition stops precisely where the text turns from description into something else. He offers no footnote explaining the cut. He offers no acknowledgement that a cut occurred at all. Neither Marchetti nor Aldwych has ever suggested anything supernatural. That is not the pattern here. The pattern is quieter than that. It is 2 credentialed people, working independently, decades apart, arriving at the same invisible wall and stopping. Patterns like that don't happen by accident. What makes this particular passage different from the rest of the suppressed Enoch material isn't its subject. Ancient texts describing the heavens are common enough across this tradition. What makes it different is a single word choice, repeated 3 times across both manuscript traditions, applied to a planet that has no blood, no wound, and by any modern account, nothing left alive to bleed. The Ge'ez word is not the word Enoch uses elsewhere for death. It is not the word used for destruction, or fire, or ruin. It is the word used in every other instance across the entire Enoch corpus for an open wound on a living body. That word is applied to the red world in the sky above us, and it does not stay there. Something happens partway through this passage that neither Marchetti's abstract nor Aldwich's edition prepares you for. The description stops being about Mars. The Second Judgment Cycle opens its description of the red world plainly, the way a report reads rather than a poem. It says the world was covered in a dust the color of an open wound, that this dust did not settle but rose and moved with the wind across the whole surface, and that beneath this dust the ground itself had been laid bare, stripped of whatever once covered it. Mars is covered in iron oxide dust. That dust does not stay still. Planet-wide dust storms on Mars, some large enough to obscure the entire globe from orbit, have been directly observed and measured by NASA's Mars Global Surveyor, and later confirmed in higher resolution by the Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter. The 2018 global dust storm that ended the Opportunity rover's mission lasted for months and covered the entire planet in the same red particulate. The text describes rising and moving rather than resting. The text calls this bleeding. The dust does not fall, it circulates, endlessly, over an exposed surface. That alone would be a coincidence worth noting and moving past. But the passage does not stop at the surface. It goes further, describing what should be above the dust, and finds almost nothing there. It says the air above the red world had grown too thin to hold weight, too thin to carry rain, too thin to protect what lay beneath it from the light of the sky. Mars's atmosphere today is less than 1% as thick as Earth's. It cannot support liquid water on the surface. It provides negligible protection from solar and cosmic radiation reaching the ground. Surface radiation levels measured by NASA's Curiosity rover since 2012 are high enough that sustained human exposure without shielding would be considered medically unacceptable by current spaceflight safety standards. An atmosphere too thin to protect anything beneath it. A surface bleeding red dust into open sky. The text describes both conditions in the same breath, without separating them, as if they were a single ongoing event rather than two unrelated facts about a dead planet. They are not unrelated. They are the same event, described in two different centuries by two completely different methods of observation. But there is a detail in the manuscript that neither Marchetti's abstract nor any published translation addresses directly. The word used for the thinning air is not the word Enoch uses elsewhere for simple absence. It is the word he uses for something being taken. Not something that was never there. Something that was removed. Removed implies a mechanism. It implies a shield existed, and something acted on it. That is where the passage goes next. The text does not linger on describing loss. It moves immediately to explaining what was lost. The second judgment cycle says the red world once carried an unseen covering, something the manuscript describes as wrapped around the world rather than resting on it, and that this covering held back a fire from the sky that the ground itself could not survive without it. Mars had a global magnetic field roughly 4 billion years ago. That field collapsed, and researchers working with NASA's MAVEN mission in continuous orbit around Mars since 2014 have confirmed that without it, the planet had no meaningful defense against solar wind. Charged particles from the sun strip atmosphere directly from an unprotected planet, gradually, continuously, still measurably today. MAVEN's own data puts the current rate of atmospheric loss at roughly 100 grams of gas escaping into space every second. A covering wrapped around the world, removed. And after it was gone, the world could no longer hold what protected it. That is not a description of weather. That is a description of a shield failing. Here is the detail almost no popular account of this passage mentions. The Coptic fragment uses a grammatical construction for this failure that Enoch's translators elsewhere reserve for events with two locations, not one. The verb form implies the action did not happen only to the world being described. It happened to it, and it is happening to something else, in the same tense, at the same time. Every translation that includes this passage treats that construction as a scribal error. None of them explain why the same error appears in both manuscript traditions, copied independently, centuries apart, in two different scripts, by scribes who never saw each other's work. Two locations. One event, described once, in a form built for describing two. The Ge'ez text is more direct about what the second location is. It does not name it outright. Enoch rarely names things outright when the implication does the naming for him, but it uses, for the first time in the entire passage, a phrase that appears nowhere else in this section. The second world, not a second heaven, not a second sign. A second world, mentioned once, in the same breath as the shield's failure, and never explained. The manuscript moves on immediately, as if the phrase required no explanation, as if whoever wrote it assumed the reader already understood exactly which world came second. That is the part the published editions don't carry, not the description of Mars. The description of Mars is almost incidental at this point. What matters is what the text does with it once the description is finished. The phrase, the second world, appears exactly once in the surviving Ge'ez text, and exactly once in the Coptic fragment, in the same structural position in both, immediately following the description of the failed shield. Neither manuscript defines it. Neither needs to. Enoch's cosmology consistently orders its worlds by proximity to judgment, not by size or distance, and everywhere else in the corpus, when the text needs to refer to the world its human audience actually inhabits, it uses a near-identical construction, the world that came after. The second world and the world that came after are, grammatically, the same phrase, wearing two different faces across two manuscript traditions that were never in contact with each other. That is not a claim this script is making lightly. It is a claim the manuscripts are making independently, in agreement, without coordination. What the text says about the second world is short. It does not describe an event. It describes a condition, transferred. The passage states that the same covering removed from the red world had, in its own words, always been the same covering, worn thin over both, failing on one first because it was struck first, not because it was struck alone. The text does not say the second world's shield has already failed. It says the removal is the same removal, continuing, and that what happened to the first world is not a completed story but an ongoing one, further along in one place than the other. Set that against what modern science actually confirms about Earth's own protection. Earth's magnetic field is not static. Paleomagnetic records confirm, It has weakened and reversed multiple times across the planet's history, and current measurements from the European Space Agency's Swarm satellite constellation show the field's overall strength has declined by roughly 9% over the past 2 centuries, with a particularly rapid weakening documented in the region known as the South Atlantic Anomaly. No credible scientist claims Earth is undergoing Mars-style atmospheric collapse. The mechanisms, timescales, and planetary conditions are not equivalent, and this script is not claiming they are. What the text claims is narrower and, in its own way, colder. It claims the same category of process, a shield thinning, a world losing what stood between its surface and what comes from above, applies to both worlds, described as a single continuous event witnessed at 2 different stages from 2 different vantage points. The manuscript's own language for this is unambiguous in a way most translations quietly avoid rendering directly. The JS does not say the second world will suffer some future consequence. It uses a verb tense that Enoch elsewhere reserves for something already set in motion, not something predicted, already occurring, already inherited. The bleeding is not Mars's alone. Mars is simply the world where it finished first. This is where the suppression trail becomes specific rather than general. Thomas Aldwich's 2009 critical edition, the same edition that stops short of the passage's turn, includes a translator's note stating that the following verses present significant textual difficulties inconsistent with the surrounding material, and were therefore omitted from the primary translation and relegated to an untranslated appendix. That appendix has never been published. When contacted by an independent researcher in 2020 about releasing it, Aldwich's estate declined to comment on the grounds that the material required further verification. Further verification of a passage already sitting untranslated for over a decade is not a research plan. It is a shelf. Every night, the red world Enoch describes as bleeding still rises in the east, exactly where it has always risen, exactly as visible now as it was to whoever first wrote this passage down. It has not stopped bleeding. By the text's own account, it was never going to. And by the same account, in the same breath, in a grammatical construction, 2 independent manuscript traditions preserved without ever comparing notes, it was never only about the first world to begin with. Let me be clear about what is and is not being claimed here. This is not a prediction that Earth's magnetic field is collapsing on any Mars-like timeline. It is not a claim that a 2,000-year-old text possessed knowledge of modern planetary physics in any literal, verified sense. Ancient manuscripts pass through centuries of copying, translation, and interpretation, and certainty about original intent is not something any serious researcher can offer with full confidence. What can be stated is narrower and, in some ways, more unsettling for exactly that reason. 2 manuscript traditions, uncoordinated, centuries and continents apart, use identical grammatical structures to describe a single ongoing process affecting 2 worlds rather than one. A word reserved elsewhere in the same corpus for an open wound is applied to a planet with no blood left to lose. A shield described as removed, not merely absent, matches a mechanism confirmed by orbital data collected 100 generations after the text was written. And a phrase, the second world, sits exactly where the grammar demands it must, defined nowhere, needed nowhere else, because whoever wrote it assumed the reader already knew. The dust still rises and does not settle. The air above it still cannot hold what it once held. The shield spoken of as removed is still, by every measurement science can offer, being removed. And the second world, the text names once, in passing, as though the naming required no further comment, is still turning beneath the same weakening field it has always turned beneath, in the same solar wind that stripped its neighbor bare first. Thomas Aldwich's appendix remains unpublished. Elena Marchetti's focus remains elsewhere. The verses that make this passage more than a description of a dead planet remain exactly where they were left, uncut, untranslated, and unread by almost everyone who has ever quoted the lines just before them. Every night it rises in the east, red, silent, and still bleeding, and every night it rises for both of us.